Let me start tonight by playing you less than a minute of a piece I made about 11 years ago. This happened during the BP oil catastrophe. And so this was back in 2010 when the Macondo well spilled, or rather gushed, more than 200 million gallons of crude oil into the Gulf of Mexico. And that lasted for 87 days.
It's really making me sad.
Whose fault do you think it is, Kennedy?
Whoever dug a hole in the ground and made the oil spill. Because whoever did it, they owe me an apology.
Has the oil stopped coming out of the ground, or is it still coming out?
It's still coming out. It's still coming out, and I don't want it to still coming out.
Is it coming out while we're sitting here?
Yes.
Kennedy and the other first graders in this piece were my students at the time, because as you heard, audio storytelling is my second career, and it comes more or less directly out of my first career. So for a dozen or so years, I worked at this incredible school in the East Village. I taught 3rd through 6th grades. I'm pretty sure one of my former very beloved colleagues is here with us tonight. And I left full-time teaching to pursue writing, but in my final months in the classroom, I had this realization that some of what made me a good teacher could maybe make me a good radio producer. As a teacher, I've been trained to start where my students are, to listen to them, to observe them. It wasn't up to me to decide their strengths or their weaknesses. It was my job to see them, the many facets of them, and to provide a space which offered freedom, boundaries, challenges, support, and permission for them to become and grow into themselves. Being an audio documentarian is a bit like this. You're not there to change anyone. You're there to watch and listen and record. Sometimes you prod, perhaps instigate a bit, but gently and discreetly. You want to capture people being themselves, sometimes charm them into being their best selves. When you get it right, I think you hear it in the richness of the story. This is an excerpt from an audio documentary I made about a town just outside of New Orleans that no longer exists, called Fazanville.
It was a little land in between the National Monument and the National Cemetery.
I mean, when we were children, we used to run up those stairs all the time.
Yep.
We used to pick pecans, play ball out there. It was a fun place.
And the monument, too.
And the
monument. Up and
monument.
down that monument.
Yeah.
Over there. And then next, they had another house set back, which was the Mitchells. Then next was the Ballards.
But I could walk down an imaginary road and point out just about where everybody lived, you know, because it's still embedded in my mind, you know.
There was like an alley, like.
I knew it like I knew the
And
back of
they
my
had
hand.
some cages, and Pierre's lived in the alley.
See, I remember ducks. I remember more ducks than chickens. They didn't have 1 or 2 chickens. But we had duck chickens. Chickens laid the eggs. We didn't have them. We had duck eggs. Why y'all remember that?
I don't remember ever eating a duck egg.
Oh my God, you ain't ready of them.
Well, we would hunt and fish. We fished because the river was right there. And then in the back of Port of Fazanville, back by the railroad track, between the railroad track and over, we used to catch crawfish, and there was ponds back there. That night they would have dances. They would be outside sometimes. This was in the summertime. And there was a band was playing in the yard. People were dancing out on the ground, you know. Most of the time it was Fats Domino cousin, Freddie Domino. It was good. It was nice, clean fun.
I still miss the village.
I miss the village too.
I think about the village all the
Me
time.
too. I dream about the village
all the time. I don't think about
But Fazanville was came about by ex-slaves, you know that.
I hadn't known that, but I learned it. I learned a lot about the village, which I think you can hear in these voices is still beloved, even though it no longer exists. In making this story, I manifested a reason for these people to talk about a place they love. I asked about it, but more importantly, I listened to what they had to say. As a radio producer, I have gear to help me listen, and I think I can show you what that looks like. Here we go. Hopefully you see that. Something happens to me when I slip on these headphones and point my microphone at another person. There's an intention to it. The world narrows in as though it's just this other person and myself, like there's a force field around us. Everything else goes away. Every fiber of me is attuned to them, to their voice. I'm not hoping to get the gist of something. I want the particular. And this is really important. I want people to sound like themselves. Their inflection and emphasis, where they pause, their word choice, their accents. I want all of this. Every drop of a person's sonic fingerprint. Voices are the backbone of my audio documentaries. And there is nothing like the human voice. It is so intimate and personal and unique. Let's just take a moment and each of us think about someone you love. Think about their voice. It's almost like you had a little visit with that person, isn't it? We feel close to someone when we hear their voice. In her book, We Need to Talk, radio journalist Celeste Headley writes about the art of listening. Headley advises, listen to the words they're actually saying instead of listening for certain words or names and making assumptions about what they mean. Before going on an interview, some reporters write out these long lists of questions. And I get it, you don't want to forget things. And sometimes you need really specific questions answered. But I never feel at ease doing this. How can I possibly know what to ask somebody without first knowing what they're going to say or how they're going to say it? I mean, sometimes the best question is, really? Headley writes, respond to what a person says, not to what you think they said or what you expected them to say. As teachers, you know what happens when you deeply listen to a student, when you look at them, not only with your eyes, but with your entire body, fully engrossed, waiting, calmly holding the space. You nod, perhaps smile, your body is relaxed, your face an invitation. It can be challenging to make time to do this as a teacher, to ignore everything else, to not turn and confront the hubbub in the corner or answer the call of your name. But when you can manage it, when you stay with one person listening, which can entail just a lot of waiting, you bestow an enormous gift upon that person because deep, focused listening communicates you matter, your ideas matter. When you listen, you create safety. You build a bulwark around the passing of time. And this is why I believe deep listening can be transformative. I produced a story last year that was rather breathtaking, both in its intimacy and its trauma. So I want to warn you, there is violence in the story you're about to hear. This is a story about a young man named Hakeem Carter. One night when he was 23, Hakeem was walking home from his job at a karaoke bar in the French Quarter in New Orleans. It was late at night, and a truck started following him.
I guess they had the high beams on, so I couldn't really look and see what type of truck it was. Next thing I knew, I had him running towards me with a shotgun. I couldn't think of nothing. I was in complete shock. And he ran towards me. He drew the gun. I don't know where the shotgun came from. I guess he drew it out of his pants. And he ran towards me. He grabbed me and was like, don't go nowhere. Like, you coming with us. I thought I was going to be kidnapped. It was 3 guys. Thought they was going to throw me in the truck. But they took me on the side of the street with the church. And went in my pockets, basically interrogated me. Like, it was weird. Like, where I was coming from. Did I have kids? What I'm doing out, how old am I? It was just random questions that I figured was just to throw my attention off what was going on. When I woke up and looked down, my orange shirt was completely red, like I bought it that color. My dickies was soaked with blood to whereas the dicky patch on my pants was just red. My Jordans was just covered in blood. I'm saying to myself, like, man, he shot me. He shot me.
So there's a lot more to this brutal attack. Actually, Hakeem tells it in detail, but I want to skip ahead. An emergency room doctor living nearby, he heard the shots, woke up, ran outside and started giving Hakeem first aid while his girlfriend called the paramedics. Hakeem survived this attack physically, but he was left with a lot of trauma.
A lot of people think I'm crazy. A lot of people look at me as psychotic. A lot of people look at me as trouble. But it's because they don't understand where I come from. You would never understand how that feels until it is done. Every time I look in the mirror, he shot me. I take a bath, he shot me. I go use the bathroom, he shot me. I have a scar everywhere on my body. People would come in a supermarket not knowing that I'm the department manager, and they'll go asking everybody else for something next because they didn't want to look at my face. I was missing 9 teeth. I was called the Hunchback of Notre Dame at this time. Snagging all mouth. I had people introducing me as they probably got shot up. That's not cute. Like, what type of stripes or credibility you expecting from this?
So another person we eventually meet in the story is Hakeem's mother, Karen Carter. And here's a clip of her.
After his shooting, it took a long time for him to be around crowds and even go to the store. So that's what made him get a gun. But he got it the legal way. He didn't buy nothing off the street. He went to the gun store, made sure they did the background check, so he had people and everything. He didn't have it for trouble. He had it for protection, and it's protection that he needs.
As soon as I was able to walk on my feet again, just that quick. I had bought one, then I had bought two, then I had bought three, and I actually used to watch TV with a Glock 21 right here, and a Glock 17 right here. And I used to tell my mom, you will probably want to tell anybody who come in here to call before they come in. The only person who understood it was my mom. My mom did not complain about those guns being right here.
And it is just from one mistake. Instead of him having it on a holster exposed, he had it in his pocket. And that's where the nightmare began.
So the nightmare that Karen's referring to isn't the attack. It's what happened to Hakeem after that, how he was treated by the criminal legal system. As you heard, Hakeem didn't feel safe after he was attacked unless he had a gun. Well, one night he was out walking with a friend. And this is important. Hakeem's friend was dressed in white, but Hakeem was wearing a black t-shirt. At the same time, a call went out over the police radio about a shooting. The suspect was a black man wearing a black t-shirt, running. When 2 officers saw Hakeem walking with his friend and wearing a black t-shirt, they stopped him, searched him, and found his gun in his waistband. Hakeem had a permit to own this gun, but he didn't have another permit, which he didn't even know he needed, a permit to conceal the gun. So that was his crime, not carrying his gun out in the open in his hand or in a holster. So the police arrested Hakeem, charged him, and took him to jail, where he spent several days until his mother got bail money together. Hakeem was a kid who went to work and church and played video games inside. He'd never had a problem with the legal system before. And then came this, a painful ordeal that lasted for years. Here's Hakeem's public defender, Eliza.
First of all, he had no priors. He's never been in trouble. The whole reason he carries a gun, the reason why most people want to own guns is for protection. And of all people to want to have protection, Hakeem wants it more than anyway because he was a victim of such a violent crime. Whatever you find on the legal side of it, in reality, he was at the wrong place at the wrong time. He happens to be a black person, a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. He wasn't doing anything wrong. And if he had been following the law and had his gun out in the open, I just feel like there's also the potential for a bad interaction with police or with others. From a legal perspective, I thought we had a pretty good case that we could argue that they had no probable cause to stop him. If you have reasonable suspicion to believe someone has committed, is committing, or will commit a crime, you can stop them and kind of investigate more. We weren't arguing that the cops were necessarily lying or anything like that, or that Hakeem didn't have a gun on him. I mean, the facts weren't in dispute. It was whether they had a reason to stop him in the first place. And unfortunately, we lost that argument. Who's labeled a victim and who's labeled a defendant? I mean, his story and many other stories is just the lines are very blurred, I think. It's rarely clear cut. He was carrying this gun because he was brutally assaulted, and I wish I could have won for him.
What bothered Hakeem the most was that his judge didn't listen to him. Hakeem says the judge stereotyped him. He wasn't interested in hearing Hakeem's story or in learning what had happened to him. Hakeem says to the judge, he was just another Black man with a gun.
I'm not a criminal. I'm not a criminal. I'm Black, yes. I'm tatted, yes. Maybe have the image of a thug, yes. But you don't know me.
You can hear in Hakeem's voice how he feels about not being known, about not being listened to. I made this story about Hakeem as part of my public radio project, which I started 6 years ago, called Imprisoned. The idea was to amplify the voices of people caught in the ripples of mass incarceration. Daughters, brothers, mothers, sons, people like Hakeem and his mom, Karen, doing time outside. I wanted to bring Hakeem's complex and thought-provoking story into proximity with people who otherwise would likely never meet him or make time to consider him. People who happen to turn on their radios or podcast feeds while cooking dinner or driving home from work. Suddenly, they were listening to Hakeem. And disappointingly, this story did not eradicate the false dichotomy of victim-criminal that we have in this country. It didn't stop other young Black men from being racially profiled. But at the very least, I think it did do something for Hakeem. After I finish a story, I always want to hear from the people in it. What did they think? After this story aired, Karen, Hakeem's mother, texted me to say they'd listened to it together and that she liked it. She wrote, Hakeem's story needed to be heard. Hakeem also texted. He said, it was perfect. I broke down listening to it. What Hakeem also got to hear in this story is that despite how he was treated by the police and the judge, some people had listened to him. People like his public defender, Eliza. Hakeem also texted, even Eliza had my back. That made me cry even more. The story made Hakeem feel listened to. What is it about being listened to? Why does it make us feel more whole? Early on in Imprisoned, I went into high school classrooms. I wanted young people to be a part of this public radio project in some way. What I didn't expect to find was how many students in New Orleans had a loved one behind bars, roughly a third of the students in the classes I visited. Studies show how keeping in touch with those loved ones is crucial to a young person's positive development. It's also cumbersome and really expensive. If you're poor and don't have a car, visiting someone in prison can be impossible. And calling, hearing that ever important voice, is so expensive. Prison phone calls can cost 20 to 30 times more than regular phone calls, which is a whole other wealth extraction story. The upshot is that many of the young people I met keep in touch with their fathers, uncles, and brothers through letters. And to my delight, some students, like Anissa, were happy to read them to me.
I'm not a baby anymore. You still taking me to prom. I really miss you. You're the only guy that kept it real with me.
Anissa Christmas just finished her sophomore year at Sci-High. She tries to keep in touch with her incarcerated brother through letters.
I had some good news. I won first place in science fair. I'm a geek. We're going to regionals. Can't you believe it? High school is going by super fast. In less than 2 years, I hope you'll be able to see me walk across the stage.
Just asking about these young people, about their letters, there was something just in that. It gave them an opening, a reason to talk about a person and a part of their lives that doesn't always see the light. My asking, but more importantly, my listening, was an invitation to express their deep love. Clearly, these letters were precious, so I wanted to know where they were kept.
Anissa keeps her brother's most recent letter in her bedroom.
I have it sit there in the mirror, and it's right there behind my tiara. Every year that I wanted a tiara in, he tried to help me make a wooden tiara. He helped me paint it and put glitter on it. So I keep it right there behind her. I just really worried because I could imagine him sitting down on the bed. I could just hear him writing, and I could hear his voice.
I could hear his voice, the surrogate for the person. In one classroom I visited, it was comprised of students from all over the city, and they had something very specific they wanted to talk about, feeling like prisoners themselves because of the ways they were treated inside their schools. One particularly vocal student was Asha Lane. Here's the story I made with her. Here's how it opens.
So when I walk into the building of my school, on both sides of the hallway, there's a security guard on each side. And then when you go up the steps on each level, there's a security guard on each side. They have on white shirts with a badge, black slacks, and a belt with a walkie-talkie, and a gun strapped to their waist, kind of like police officers. And it just doesn't make me feel like I'm in a space where, you know, I'm welcome, and I feel like I'm in a space where I'm just supposed to be controlled. And it just doesn't feel safe, you know, for me to learn.
Making stories about the criminal legal system can be super draining. I was recently asked about this story. Why did I choose to pursue this topic, security and discipline in high school? And the frank answer is, I didn't. I chose to listen to a classroom of young people and consider what they said. And I chose to ask Asha if she wanted to take it further. I was so happy she did. Here's another clip from the story we made together.
On social media, we see security guards slam kids on the floor. And at my school, we fear that that could happen to us at any moment. The school is tense. The security guards yell and treat us like we're inmates. They routinely grab students by their shirts, and they're big guys, so they often physically pick students up off the floor. When there's a fight, they don't hesitate to tackle students. My friend Ronnie thinks they're setting exactly the wrong example.
It's like they're trying to solve violence with violence, and we're not in a prison. This is school. We're supposed to be here to get our education. If you want to teach us something, how about you teach us not to solve violence with violence and stop putting your hands on us, and we might stop putting our hands on each other.
It was such an amazing experience to both give Asha this platform and then for her in turn to be able to give it to her friends and other students in the school system. You know, and when we made this story, when I made this whole season, I used to think, you know, if people just knew, if they saw and they heard how different reality is from what we were taught in school about the criminal justice system or what we see on TV, things would just change. Well, on good days, I see that things are changing slowly, perhaps glacially, but as a whole, I mean, that change is very slow. We're pointing in a better direction, but that change is very slow. But regardless of whether the system is changing writ large, I think that, you know, which is unrealistic by stories. One thing I am certain about is that being listened to and being heard changes the person. It changes the person I'm interviewing. One of my heroes is Studs Terkel. Let me see, there he is. He's a great documentarian, writer, radio personality, and he wrote, "What I bring to the interview is respect. The person recognizes that you respect them because you're listening. Because you're listening, they feel good about talking to you." When we listen deeply, we create room to feel all the things. We invite calm and agency. We build capacity and connection. To borrow an idea from Brian Stevenson, we make ourselves proximate to other people's realities. Maya Angelou said, "At the end of the day, people won't remember what you said or did. They will remember how you made them feel." Being listened to makes people feel good. As teachers, the consequences for not listening can be grave. Here's one last story I did for Unprisoned called The Myth of the Super Predator. It's a half-hour-long documentary centered on one person's story in order to debunk this false notion that some children are born bad. And it begins like this.
I did a lot of stealing, bringing it in, people homes.
You're how old?
8, 9, going on 10.
Joelle Ware grew up in New Orleans. His older brother David taught him how to cut grass, which is what he was doing when he met these two older guys, brothers, named Corey and Stelly. One day, Joelle went with them to rob a gas station.
Class, caught the bus from Lower Ninth Ward all the way to the West Bank, and they handed me a handkerchief, told me to cover my face up. Corey had a little revolver. It was 22, and I don't even think they had any bullets in it.
Joelle had never held a gun before. He was 10 years old. So do you remember, what was your reaction when they handed you this gun?
Well, there was no reaction. I mean, it was one of those things where you just felt like you was a part of something. They sent me in because I was young. I walked into the store, and it was an old lady. I told her, "Give me all your money." And she just froze and looked at me. They came in behind me, and they had bandanas on as well. One of them had a hood on. And they were talking to her, telling her, "The little guy's not playing, we're sticking you up."
The lady was nervous, and so was Joelle. He kept thinking about something his mother always said, respect the ladies. And he thought, what if this lady knows my mom?
I kept doing this. I kept making sure the bandana was covering my face, And I was nervous, yeah. There was no tough guy about it, I just was following through, I know she put a rolls of quarters in the bag. A lot of her scratch tickets were out. I remember grabbing some of those. And we ran.
Here's what 10-year-old Joelle learned that day. Robbing, he was good at it.
I felt like it was nothing. I felt like it was easy. It's like, oh, that was it. That's what that was about, I felt like it was doable.
Here was a place where Joelle fit in, where he was praised and accepted, something all children want. Over the years, Joelle acquired more and more skills as a criminal. He was a smart kid and a good learner. But when he was 14, Joelle was finally caught and sentenced to juvenile life, which means he spent 7 years behind bars until he was 21 years old. When he got out, Joelle was determined to close that chapter of his life. And because he'd been convicted in juvenile court, Joelle didn't have a record to follow him. He had a clean slate. So he went to college and then graduate school for social work. In fact, Joelle eventually found himself back in the same courtroom of the judge who'd sentenced him. Only this time, Joelle was there representing his clients. So things ended up okay for Joelle. This is what he looks like as an adult, which is pretty rare and definitely worth celebrating. But I wonder if Joelle's life could have taken a more direct path to success. He told me another story that as an educator, I found especially upsetting.
There were times where I tried to do something other than things that I was doing that put me in a juvenile prison.
Joelle tried football, basketball, drumming. Most beloved was fishing. But each time, instead of being accepted or encouraged, he got smacked down.
I think if I would have had someone pull me to the side and say, "Hey man, I'm going to teach you how to be a fisherman," all they would have had me. They would have had me. It was to the point where we had career day, and they tell you to come to school dressed accordingly for career day. I had no idea that you're supposed to come dressed with a professional attire. So I came dressed like I was going fishing. I caught the bus from uptown to downtown with some rubber boots on, some clothes that you put on when you go fishing, a fishing pole. Look, when I got in the classroom, the lady, Miss Pitts, told me, she said, "Mr. Ware, stand up." She said, "You do know when you come dressed for career day, you don't dress as if you are at work. You come dressed in a suit, shirt, pants, and tie, and you tell us what it is you want to become." And class kind of chuckled a little bit, This is when I started cutting class. When I lady did that, oh man, I left and hooked up with some guys that was cutting class. Some of them were fishing, or breaking in houses. But that day, I remember that day. I thought I was doing the right thing. You have no idea how I got dressed, excited. Oh man! Because when they say career day, I'm thinking I want to be a fisherman. I would tell everybody that.
Maybe like you, I want to reach back in time and shake Miss Pitts. I want to tell her to listen to this child, to smile at Joelle and say, "You look like you're ready for work. Tell us more about what you want to do." I want to suggest she ask around for someone who can take this child fishing. Or maybe her class could study fish or water or waterways, which are all around New Orleans. I want to remind Miss Pitts how important she is to her students, how much her words matter, how her capacity to listen to them communicates their value. And at the same time, I feel shame because I know I have been Miss Pitts, likely far more times than I'm even aware of. As a teacher and as a human, I definitely get grumpy or even angry in the course of a chaotic day when my hard-made plans do not go as planned. I know I fail to listen. Listening is a practice. It's a habit you sometimes have to work to instill. But what I found is it will not drain you. It will replenish you. Mark Twain wrote, "If we were supposed to talk more than we listen, we would have 2 tongues and 1 ear." Now, I realize I'm talking about listening plucked from a different moment in time. These days, it's not so common to be in a room with another person where you can see their mouth as it moves, and they can see yours as it opens in amazement or lifts in a smile, or as your bottom lip curls, signaling, "I feel bad that you have this pain." So these days, perhaps listening is more than a practice. It's also an act of invention. My dad died this past September, and as he was lying in a hospital bed in Maryland, I was here in New Orleans. He was intubated and sedated, but his nurses said we could call. They would put the phone to his ear. They said hearing is the last sense to go. So I called every day and talked to him. I've had his record collection for years, and every day I would hold the phone to my record player and play some of his favorites for him: Pete Seeger and Odetta, Josh White, Joan Baez. I like to think that he was listening. When things are hard to look at, when we want to block out the light, we close our eyes, but we have no flaps for our ears. Human beings are built to listen. Thank you all so much.
All right, thank you so much, Eve. Yeah, that was wonderful. I really love when you said the line that the capacity to listen communicates value to people. I think that was really wonderful. All right, we are able to open up the Q&A now. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and use that raise hand option if you want to ask over the video, or you're also welcome to type your questions into the chat at the bottom and we can get those questions asked. All right, Brandy, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for all of that. And I'm wondering, how have you found listening on the age of Zoom?
Oh, well, tonight, very frustrating. I mean, actually not listening, more the presenting. You know, it's not bad. I've done a couple interviews over Zoom. It's not bad. I mean, at least you can make eye contact. It's not the same. I think there's something that happens when you're in physical proximity to someone. And I think we're trying our best given our situation, but it's really not the same. You know, I think you cannot but have empathy with somebody when you're close to them and you're hearing their story. And yeah, I don't know. I wonder how you find it. You probably have to do it a lot more than I do.
I'm finding it impossible.
Yeah.
But no, and so I agree. I didn't know if you had a workaround or have found something, but because even in person you would lean in, but like Like that's like, it's almost all of the wrong verbal body clues, body language. So much doesn't translate.
I agree. It's
Thank
so
you.
challenging.
I'm comforted knowing that you also find it difficult. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Great. Thanks, Brandy. All right. Let's see. We have another question in the chat. Kit wants to know, how do we teachers connect students' stories to math class?
Oh,
Thoughts on that?
That's a great question. I mean, I guess it depends what kind of math you're teaching, but I mean, you know, I think I remember hearing that the main problem with math for a lot of kids is reading. You know, it's the stories. So if there can be, I mean, I guess if with simple, like if you're telling story problems, of course we can make that personal, and we can put it in a child's life and maybe put it in a real situation. But I don't know how you would do that for, you know, a lot of advanced math. It's a great question. I feel like if we sat down together, we could maybe figure it out, but I haven't honestly given it a lot of thought. But I mean, I wonder, well, maybe one thing, I think a lot of people have anxiety around math, and maybe that is something that could be talked about. I was just reading an article in the New York Times, which I thought I should incorporate this into my talk, but I just read it the other night, and it's all about doctors who are, the title is Doctors Urge to Elicit Stories Behind the Pain. And it's all about doctors being trained to listen to people's stories as a way to help them. And there's just one quote, I might as well read it. So this one student, I think it's at Columbia, he said, "Simply listening to people's stories can be therapeutic. If there is fluid in the lungs, you drain it. If there is a story in the heart, it's important to get that out too. It is also a medical intervention, just not one that can be easily quantified." So I wonder if there's something there with math, that maybe it's talking around what the issues are, or talking about it more. I'm not sure, but I bet you and your colleagues could figure it out.
Yeah, this kind of goes to, you're kind of addressing another question that we were getting of, you know, the idea of using stories as a way to elicit responses in the classroom, and that those can be great ways to connect with students and, again, go back to like add value, make them feel safe in the classroom, and share with them. Okay, so we do have another question from JC, who introduced us earlier. How do you prepare for your stories, and do you prepare questions? How do you combat the challenge of asking questions and listening simultaneously?
So JC, do you mean my interviews, or when I go to put a story together? I'm guessing you mean my interviews. How do I prepare?
No, just more like how do you prepare? You know, because like we as teachers would love to elicit stories and get our students to talk, but we also have 35 questions ready in our head to challenge their understanding. So how do you find that balance in your line of work?
I mean, I really think it's deeply listening to where they are, you know, being as open, both physically and with your language. Like, one of the first things I often ask is like, well, can you introduce yourself? Who are you? And I'm really just watching them and listening to them. So, you know, sometimes I do have things I need to know, like, why did you vote for Bill 364 last year? You know, and I have that question in my mind, and I'm really listening for something that can kind of get to a middle point of where I need to go. So I prepare with, you know, thinking about what I need for my purposes. And as a teacher, I think it's like, what do I need you? What do I hope you're walking away with understanding? But then really trying to listen to, well, where are you with that? Like, so what's the next place I can get you to, you know? So when I'm interviewing somebody, I'm being as open with my questions as I possibly can, and kind of trying to, you know, I mean, sometimes I'll just say, tell me more, which I learned to say as a teacher. Tell me more about that. You know, or what did that look like? Or what, you know, just asking for details, because I need very specific things to make a radio story. It's different than when you're teaching. But I guess the ways that they're similar is that I want when I'm interviewing somebody, I want them to say things that I know I can use to help other people who are not in that room create a picture in their mind. And when you're teaching somebody, you're trying to make something, you're trying to make a young person or an older person actually see something that, or grasp something that they're not quite there yet. So it's like trying to find a middle place between what you need and where they are. I know this is very vague, but that's what I do. So I prepare by knowing as much as I can about them. Although sometimes I don't actually even want to do that because I'm afraid that if I know too much, I'll be too leading. I'll want certain things. And what I really want is them to feel relaxed. So in a way, maybe I prepare by being relaxed myself. I want to communicate, you're safe and I care about you and we're just going to hang out and talk. And whatever you have to say, that's great.
Great. Okay. We have another question in the chat. Brian asks, in what ways do you feel that educators can use this kind of deep listening that we're talking about to better understand the lived experiences of their students?
Well, I think it's everything. I mean, kids come to school as a whole complete person with a whole reality that we don't know about. I mean, that's the thing with Ms. Pitts. I don't think she was a jerk. She just had no idea whatever her student was going through. And I mean, I think it's everything. I think you can teach lots of things through telling, through communicating to a person, you matter, your stories matter, you're important to me. Yeah, I don't know how to break it down because to me, it's everything. Can you repeat the question, Jen? Maybe there's a nugget.
Sure. Yeah. It's the question is just like, are there any elements of this deep listening that teachers can bring to their classroom to better understand what their students are living through?
Yeah, I mean, I think writing is a great place where we can learn a lot about our students, but also, whatever we're teaching, I mean, books are obviously a great connection. Like, well, how do you connect with that? Or does this remind you of anything in your life? Like, just always trying to, make the questions apply to them as a person. History, science, like, what does this make you think about? How do you connect with this? I guess just like constantly putting it on their terms. And I mean, maybe they'll be the ones that tell you. I think it's more like making a space for them to show you who they are and making, creating an atmosphere where they feel comfortable doing that, where they can show up and bring themselves and their creativity so that, it doesn't all have to come from you. It's more like, I don't know, sometimes I felt like teaching was like throwing a good party. Like you're just making sure that all the provisions are there so that people can just be.
Right. That's great. We have a question. I think this is something I think a lot of teachers think about and try to find a balance with. Do you ever have a struggle with compassion fatigue? And if so, how do you cope? You're hearing a lot of traumatic stories, and I think they'd love to hear just how do you deal with hearing all these different things throughout the day?
Yeah, it's really hard. It's really, really hard. The Joelle story, which I just played for you, that took me like a year to get over. I go to therapy, I swim, I do yoga, I have a garden. You have to make time for yourself. And I think you also have to know your limits. I've been making these stories for like 6 years and I'm taking a break right now because it's very draining. And, I mean, there's so much trauma. I mean, there's just so much trauma in the world. And you do absorb that trauma hearing it. I did another project, which I almost played you some stories from, but it was a little too rough. It was about young people telling the life stories of people who've been killed through gun violence. And these weren't stories about their death. They were stories about their lives, their lived lives. So it was positive in that way, but it was really hard. But these young people just, they loved it. I mean, at first they had no idea what I was talking about. They didn't know what a radio documentary is. And their idea of radio is like, it was not the kind of public radio that I listened to, but it was so good for them to be able to tell their stories. And but hearing them, that's hard. You have to make time. I mean, I take baths, I take walks, and I don't know what to say except take care of yourself and don't overburden yourself, and try to know what your limits are.
Right. I think that's what we're all kind of learning right now, is how to take care of ourselves in this crazy time. We have kind of an interesting question. Where did it go? From Dionysia. She says, as a teacher, listening to my students is really important, but students have problems of listening to teachers. So do you have any way that you can teach students to listen or be more active listeners?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I think complimenting is always the best way to go, right? Oh, I love the way you're looking at me. You know, I think sometimes we lie our way to get to where we want to go. It's like when you know, somebody who doesn't know how to read, you say, "Oh, look at, you're doing such a good job holding the book," or, you know. So I think it's you know, give them as many compliments as you can for the things, even the glimmers of skills that you're seeing. Like, I love the way you just let me finish a sentence without interrupting me. I love the way you were looking at me as I was talking. I love the way when you smiled just now, I could tell you were listening to me. Or maybe not even about you, you know, maybe it's about being with another student. You know, I think if you can be around, I mean, it's hard right now. I'm sorry, I have no idea how hard your jobs are right now. My hats go off to all of you. So I don't know how you're doing it, but so I'm only referencing my time in the classroom, which was not during a pandemic. But so, you know, if there are a group of students together, you know, Corey, I love how you're listening to Janisha. You know, you did such a good job just now, nodding your head. So those kinds of things. And maybe it begins with giving them those kinds of opportunities, because it is a practice. It's a practice for all of us. I mean, I'm sure if you're anything like me, you're in conversations where you stop listening because you're just getting ready to talk. We all do this. Right. We have to practice. And so I think a lot of it is just like making situations in your classroom where you have to listen to each other. So one thing I used to do is make it when, you know, you would break up in groups and you make people accountable. Like, when you come back and share, you have to tell me the best thing that the person you were talking to said. So it kind of forces them to listen. Those kinds of things, I think.
Yeah, that's great. That's smart. I think that's a great technique. Let's see, I think there were some other questions in the chat from a little earlier. Brian Palacios asks, given your knowledge and perspective on listening, what are your experiences with and thoughts on linguistic bias?
Oh yeah, big time. It's so prevalent. I mean, you know, this is why I talked so much about, I love the way people talk. I mean, I just love it. And New Orleans, like New York, it's a blend of accents. There are so many different accents. And a lot of the time since being in New Orleans, I've worked with older kids mostly. And a lot of the time I teach English. And so what I often say is, I love the way you say that. I love, like, one of the phrases that I still delight in is, you know, well, my cat's name is, my cat that was just here is Eartha. So I would say, where Eartha at? You know, that's very New Orleans. And so I would say something like to my students, like, I love the way you say that. That's great. Is, you know, and ask them questions about it. Is that how you talk in your family, whatever? And you're like, that's a beautiful way of talking. There's this other way of talking that happens in school sometimes. It's called standard English. And it's just like another dialect. I talk about it that way. It's just it's kind of like another accent. It's another way of phrasing. And I'm going to teach you that one. You know, you can teach me yours. I'm going to teach you this one. And they're both great. And you use them in different situations. So I kind of approach it like code switching, really. But the most important thing is I tell them how beautiful the way they speak is, because that's the way they talk in their families. I mean, that's how we learn to talk. And so I want them to feel really good about it. And they should feel really good about it. Honestly, I mean, English is a changing language. And if not, it would be so boring. I delight in that. You know, I really do. When Webster's comes out and tells me their word of the year, I'm so excited. I love, like, when they became officially able to be used for a singular, I was so delighted. I mean, it's great. And that's another thing I share with my students is that English is changing and it's active, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with the way you speak. It's perfect, but there's another way. And let's learn that too.
That's wonderful. Yeah. We're seeing a lot of love that's in the comments as well. Okay, let's see. We have one more question or another question from Jessica. She says, I think I have a skill for listening, but what I struggle with is how to respond to those stories. I feel that I do not process the skills to respond appropriately like a social worker would. What should I do so that the person I'm listening to will not feel worse about what I say?
Oh, yeah. I know. I feel like as teachers and as a radio producer, I often feel like I wish I had a social work degree. In fact, I've explored that through this work. I mean, I think one thing is that you can just say, like, thank you for telling me that story. Thank you for sharing that with me. Thank you for trusting me with that. I really am just honored. I appreciate that. And I hear you and I see you. And you can also say, like, I'm not really sure what to say to you right now because I'm thinking so much about what you said. And I need some time to figure out what I'm thinking about it. But the main thing I want you to know is that this is safe with me. And I'm so touched and so honored that you felt safe enough to do that, to share this with me. I don't think you have to give people answers. I think you just have to, part of it is just that you're allowing them to let it off of them, right? Like you're helping them to express it, which is part of their healing. So it's actually not so much about you. You just need to be as open and loving as possible. And actually, let me just put a plug in here for this incredible book that everybody should read called The Body Keeps the Score. I think the author's name is Bezel van der Koek or something like that. He's got a Dutch name. The Body Keeps the Score. That will help you answer that question a lot. But I think just in general, that book is all about how trauma is held in the human body. And let's face it, most of us, and certainly most of our students, have had some degree of trauma. And it's just a really helpful text in thinking about what that means and how that might come out in the classroom. Because I think a lot of times, young people will do things and we think they're being willful or they're being this or they're being that. But really what they're doing is they're trying to survive. They're doing what they can to survive in this world. And so to answer that question, I think just to hold that space for them, that's beautiful. Don't take the pressure off yourself to say something perfect.
That's great. I think we have time for like another one or two questions. If you asked your question before and I haven't gotten to it, please feel free to put it back in the chat. Or if you haven't submitted one yet, please feel free to submit one as well. We do have one question. One of our teachers wants to know how do you navigate the racial dynamics as a white person primarily telling stories of Black people? If you could speak to that a bit.
Yeah, I don't know. I show up as myself and I get to know the people that I'm telling stories with. I know them for years and years afterwards. Part of what I do is I let them speak. It's really not about my voice. I see my job as elevating their voices. I have access to platforms that a lot of people don't. And so I try to bring them with me to those places. So sometimes that's literally like, hey, Asha, do you want to make a story with me? Because you're awesome and you have a lot to say. And if you produce this story, it's going to be entirely different than if I produce it. So I do things like that a lot. Like one of my missions is to diversify who has access to these storytelling pipelines. But then, like the story about Hakeem, my voice appears in the very beginning of that story and at the very end. And the rest of it, I'm not in it. I'm not narrating it. And that if I had my druthers, I would do that for every single story because I'm there to elevate other people's voices. So, I think also if there's something tricky, I just ask them, like, how would you say this? I don't want to get this wrong. How do I say it? What should I say here? I am who I am. I just show up with the best of intentions and as much humility as I can muster, and I do my best. And I don't claim to do it perfectly. And I'm always up for hearing how I could do it better.
Awesome. Thank you. That was a very honest and vulnerable response. So we appreciate that. Thank you.
Sure.
Let's see if I have any final questions as we wrap up. Let's see. Okay, looks like we have one. We can probably end on this question from Matt. They ask, you mentioned that being listened to changes a person, and you also mentioned not thinking about the broader system, whether it's criminal justice or education. They're trying to think through bridging those gaps, like what it would look like. I feel like changing people changes systems. And can you speak to the role of stories in changing these systems?
Yeah. I mean, I think about this a lot. I've gone through deep depressions because stories haven't, immediately like freed all these innocent people from prisons and haven't made us have a less retributional and less racist system of punishment. But like right now, so I live in New Orleans, and we've had draconian, tough on crime district attorneys for decades. I mean, really bad. Like Harry Connick Sr., the father of Harry Connick Jr., once sent a man to prison for life for stealing a television because he was able to use certain laws to do it. It's just very, very racist and retributional. And, people have been telling stories about this in New Orleans for quite some time. And it's really ramped up since Katrina. People like me and others, and also like tirelessly public defenders and lots and lots of people. In any case, the point being, we just had an election for district attorney. And I've also, by the way, just spent a lot of time telling stories about what is a district attorney and why is this job important and why should we care about this? We've listened tonight to a lot of people's stories, which I think are the most effective. But honestly, we need to understand our systems better, because law and order, this is not. So in New Orleans, we miraculously just elected an incredibly progressive district attorney. And I open the paper now every day, and I'm amazed by what's going on in a good way. I mean, in a very positive way. And I honestly, some days I can't even believe it. And it is just that thing. It's like all these butterfly wings, just like thousands and thousands of butterfly wings made a wind that blew in change. But it's hard sometimes. You want like this person's life to be better, this person's life to be better, this innocent man who's been in prison for 24 years. Why is he there? It's infuriating. So it's easy to get so frustrated by that. But that's why I like that story about our district attorney, because I can't believe it happened, and it did. And now concrete, visceral change is happening in people's lives. So I think all those things, they're cumulative, I mean, a wonderful person on this subject who I referenced really briefly is Brian Stevenson. And he's a beautiful storyteller, and, an attorney. And through his work telling stories, I think what's happening is, not just one person's mind is shifting, but the consciousness of our nation is really shifting. And I think that's how it happens. People are not convinced by facts. I don't think they are. People are convinced by stories. It gets in you. Stories get inside you. All
right. I think this is a perfect moment to wrap up. Eve, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you all for your patience with all my glitches and yeah,
it was great. It was great to listen to all your different stories and see how teachers can tie these things into their classrooms to better connect with their students and meet them where they're at and find ways to make learning safe and support them where they're at. So thank you so much. I hope everyone had a great time. It was wonderful seeing all your faces on the Zoom, and I hope you all have a wonderful night. Thanks so much for coming.
Bye-bye.